Chicago, Illinois, a city of endless contradictions. For some, it's a city of opportunity and new beginnings. But for others, it's a place where tradition and religion hold you in an unrelenting grip. Immani thought she had found her escape when she married Darius in 2017. She envisioned a life filled with love and promise. Yet, as the years passed without a child, the whispers in their religious community grew louder. In their world, childlessness wasn't just a private struggle. It was seen as a failure, a sign of God's displeasure. Immani's dream of building a family slowly morphed into a nightmare. Every dinner, every Sunday service seemed to circle back to one question: when will you have a baby? Little did Immani know the answer to that question would unravel her life in ways she could never have imagined. And soon, the pressures of tradition would push her beyond her limits. At a Sunday dinner in late 2018, the tension in the air was thick. Immani sat quietly next to her husband Darius, her mind already buzzing with the subtle hints and loaded comments about their lack of children. But that night, the conversation took a darker turn. Ezekiel, Darius's father, leaned forward, his voice authoritative yet calm. "Immani," he said, "the family line must continue. God has given us this trial to overcome, and we must fulfill our duty." His words carried a weight that seemed to crush Immani. Ezekiel explained that since Darius couldn't father a child, it would fall upon him, as the family patriarch, to ensure the line was continued. The elders of the church had already agreed that this was God's will. Immani's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was a command cloaked in religious obligation. If she refused, the consequences would be unthinkable: exile from the community, isolation from her family, and the destruction of her entire life. Immani's journey into this web of control didn't begin with her marriage to Darius. It started long before, in her childhood. Raised on Chicago's South Side, Immani's life was governed by religious doctrine. Her father, a strict and devout man, made all the decisions. In their house, there was no room for questioning, no space for rebellion. Obedience was paramount. As a young girl, Immani had dreams of going to college, of traveling, of breaking free from the community's grip. But her father had other plans. The moment Darius entered their lives, it became clear that her future had already been decided. The marriage wasn't forced, but it was expected. Immani believed she could find happiness with Darius, perhaps even build a new life, but that dream was shattered as soon as the pressures to bear children began. Now, with Ezekiel's proposition looming over her, Immani realized that her life had never truly been her own. A few days after the fateful dinner, Ezekiel requested to speak with Immani alone. They met in the living room of his expansive home, the air thick with tension. Ezekiel wasted no time, getting straight to the point. "Immani," he began, his tone cold and authoritative, "God has shown us the way. You must understand, this is not just for the family, it's for the community, for our faith." His eyes locked onto hers, unblinking, as he laid out his sinister plan. If Darius couldn't give her a child, then Ezekiel would step in. This, he claimed, was not just a practical solution, but a divine one, an act of sacrifice for the family's future. Immani felt the room spin. He spoke of duty, of religious obligation, twisting faith into a weapon of control. She knew what this meant. If she refused, she would lose everything: her family, her home, her entire community. But accepting it meant submitting to a nightmare beyond her worst imagination. For weeks, Immani grappled with the horror of Ezekiel's plan. She confided in Darius, hoping he would stand up to his father. But late one night, the truth surfaced, and it was far worse than she had imagined. Darius sat her down, his face expressionless, as he revealed his complicity. "I knew from the beginning," he said, his voice hollow. "I knew I couldn't give you a child, and I agreed with my father. This is how it has to be." Immani's heart shattered. The man she thought would protect her had been part of this plan from the very start. He tried to rationalize it, framing it as a religious duty. "It's what's expected of us," he said. Immani felt sick, betrayed by the one person she thought was on her side. Darius wasn't just unwilling to fight for her, he had accepted her fate long before she even knew it. Her last hope of escape crumbled in that moment. The night of the ritual arrived, a cold and quiet evening. Immani had been invited to Ezekiel's house for what was supposed to be a family dinner. The room was dimly lit, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken tension. Immani sat at the table, her hands trembling. She had tried to steel herself against what was to come, but nothing could prepare her for the horror. As she sipped her water, her vision blurred. They had drugged her. Before she knew it, she was being carried to a bedroom, a room that smelled of incense and betrayal. Her consciousness faded in and out, but she was painfully aware of what was happening. Ezekiel, under the guise of fulfilling God's will, violated her in the name of family legacy. She was powerless to stop it. The next morning, Immani woke in that same room, her body aching, her mind foggy. She knew what had happened, but the reality of it was too much to bear. Ezekiel had carried out his plan, and now her life was forever changed. The morning after the ritual was a blur of confusion and pain. Immani lay in bed, her body weak, her mind racing. Ezekiel, cold and indifferent, acted as if nothing had happened. He went about his day, satisfied that his sacrifice had been made. Darius was nowhere to be found, his silence speaking louder than any words. Immani felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of her violation and the knowledge that everyone around her viewed it as normal. The community too saw the ritual as a necessary act. They believed it was God's will, that Immani's role as a wife had been fulfilled. But Immani could feel the walls closing in. She couldn't live like this, under the control of people who saw her as nothing more than a vessel for their legacy. She had to get out. She had to escape. But how could she when every move she made was watched, scrutinized, and controlled? As the weeks passed, the family's control over Immani became more insidious. They began drugging her food, making her feel foggy and disoriented. It became harder and harder for her to think clearly, to remember the details of what had happened. They told her that what she had experienced was God's plan, that her protests were a sign of weak faith. Loretta, Darius's mother, whispered in her ear that she should be grateful, that Ezekiel had done what was necessary for the family. But Immani wasn't buying it. Despite the drugs, despite the manipulation, she knew the truth. She wasn't losing her mind. This wasn't God's plan. It was control, plain and simple. But every time she tried to resist, every time she tried to speak out, they turned her own words against her. They made her feel small, insignificant, like her voice didn't matter. But Immani knew she had to hold on to the truth. She couldn't let them break her. One afternoon, while cleaning out a closet in Ezekiel's house, Immani made a discovery that would change everything. Hidden behind old boxes, she found a journal, Naomi's journal. Naomi had been Ezekiel's wife, a quiet woman who had passed away years earlier. As Immani flipped through the pages, her heart sank. The journal detailed years of abuse, control, and manipulation. Naomi had suffered in silence, trapped in the same cycle that Immani now found herself in. She had written about her despair, her longing for freedom, and her fear of speaking out. Immani's blood boiled. This wasn't just about her, this was about generations of women who had been silenced, used, and discarded. But now, Immani had something Naomi never did: the will to fight back. She wasn't going to let this cycle continue. Armed with the knowledge of Naomi's suffering, Immani resolved to break free, no matter the cost. She would not be another victim. The final breaking point came during a tense family gathering. Ezekiel, smug and satisfied with himself, hinted that they might need to repeat the ritual to ensure conception. Immani's blood ran cold. She couldn't take it anymore. She had endured enough. That night, while the family sat in the living room, deep in conversation, Immani quietly slipped away. She knew exactly what she had to do. She found Ezekiel's hunting rifle locked in a cabinet. Her hand shook as she loaded it, but her mind was clear. This was the only way to end the nightmare. With the rifle in hand, she made her way back to the living room. Ezekiel was seated in his chair, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Immani raised the rifle, her heart pounding in her chest. Without hesitation, she pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, echoing through the house. Ezekiel slumped forward, dead. The nightmare was over, or so she thought.